They say a bridge is just a way to get from point A to point B. But when your father spent an entire summer sweating over every cedar plank and hand-driving every rusted nail into the silt of a creek bed, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a piece of him that stays behind long after he's gone. My name is Elena, and for 30 years, that bridge was my sanctuary, a quiet stretch of wood crossing over Miller's Creek in the backwoods of Oregon, connecting my porch to the old oak grove where the world felt like it stopped spinning for a while. It survived the flood of '96 and the ice storm of 2012, but it turns out the one thing my dad didn't build it to withstand was the sheer, unadulterated entitlement of a homeowners association board with a construction deadline and a complete lack of a soul. It all started on a Tuesday, one of those crisp October mornings where the fog is still clinging to the water like a wet blanket, and I was sitting there with my first cup of coffee, just listening to the chickadees when the ground started to shudder. At first, I thought it was a tremor, maybe a minor quake, but then came the sound, that deep, guttural, metallic roar that doesn't belong in the woods. And before I could even set my mug down, a bright yellow cement truck, looking like a prehistoric monster, came barreling down my private drive. I watched frozen as those massive tires hit the first plank, and I swear I heard the bridge scream. A long, splintering groan that echoed off the trees, the kind of sound that makes your stomach do a slow, sick flip, because you know something beautiful just got broken. I ran out there, barefoot and waving my arms like a madwoman, trying to flag the guy down, but the driver didn't and oppose to even tap the brakes. He just stared straight ahead, chewing on a toothpick, crushing my father's legacy under 12 tons of wet concrete. He was using my bridge as a shortcut to reach the new, and quote, Willow Creek Estates, and quote, development on the other side of the ridge, a project backed by the very HOA that had been trying to get me to, and quote, upgrade, and quote, my siding for the last 3 years. By the time I reached the bank, he was gone, leaving nothing behind but the smell of diesel fumes and a trail of fresh, jagged cracks snaking through the center beam. The next morning, I was waiting at the HOA office before the lights were even on, clutching a handful of photos I'd taken of the damage, my hands shaking not from cold, but from a brand of fury I didn't oppose, Tino I possessed. The woman behind the desk, a person named Brenda, whose primary job seemed to be making people feel like an inconvenience, didn't oppose, to even look up from her monitor when I laid the pictures down. End quote. The bridge is part of the common access easement. Elena, end quote. She said, her voice is flat and rehearsed as a telemarketer in oppose. End quote. We're within our rights to utilize any established route for community infrastructure improvements, end quote. I felt the blood rush to my face, that hot, prickly heat that starts at the back of your neck. End quote. Common access? My father built that bridge in 1984. Brenda, 10 years before this HOA was even a twinkle in a developer's eye, and it sits entirely on my deeded acreage, end quote. I told her, trying to keep my voice steady, but she just gave me that pitying, end quote, bless your heart, end quote, smile that people use when they've already decided you're the crazy neighbor. End quote. We've reviewed the maps, end quote. She replied, finally looking at me with eyes like cold marbles, end quote. The board has deemed it a shared utility route, so if you have a grievance, you can file a Form 12B and we'll review it at the quarterly meeting in January. In the meantime, please move your car, you're blocking the visitor spot. End quote. I walked out of there feeling small, that hollow, helpless feeling you get when you realize the people in power are in oppose. Just wrong. They're indifferent. For the next week, it was a slow-motion execution. Every morning at 7 a.m., the trucks would come, sometimes 3 or 4 in a row, and I'd sit on my porch and watch the bridge sag lower and lower, the handrails starting to tilt at a sickening angle. I tried talking to the drivers. I tried putting up, in quote, private property, in quote, signs, which the HOA sent a maintenance guy to tear down within 4 hours, and I even tried parking my old truck in the middle of the drive, only to have a sheriff's deputy show up and tell me that since the HOA claimed it was and quote, disputed easement, and quote, I couldn't oppose. Blocked the flow of traffic until a judge ruled on it. The low point came when I found Mrs. Gable, my neighbor from down the road, standing by the creek one evening, looking at the bridge with tears in her eyes. End quote. They told us at the secret board meeting that if you keep fighting this, our dues will go up to cover the legal fees, end quote. she whispered, not even looking me in the eye, and quote, "People are starting to get real upset with you, Elena. They just want the construction finished so the dust stops," end quote. That was the moment I realized I wasn't into oppos. Just fighting the HOA. I was being framed as the villain in my own backyard by people I'd known for decades. But here's the thing about my dad. He was a surveyor before he was a carpenter, and he taught me that while people lie, the dirt doesn't in oppos. That night, I didn't in oppos. Sleep. I sat on the floor of my den with a flashlight and a box of old manila folders that had been gathering dust since he passed away 5 years ago. I went through the original land grants, the 1970s topographical surveys, and the handwritten notes he'd kept in his ledger. Around 3 a.m., I found a faded, yellowed carbon copy of a quote, revocation of access, quote, filed with the county back in the late 80s, long before the HOA bought the adjacent timberland. My dad had foreseen this. He'd legally severed the old logging trail from the rest of the parcel, meaning the quote, route, quote, the HOA was claiming didn't in oppos. Just ended my bridge. It didn't end oppos. Exist at all. The next phase was about more than just papers. It was about theater. If they wanted to play a game of, quote, shared access, quote, I was going to give them a front row seat to the reality of their choices. I spent the weekend at the hardware store, buying high-definition trail cams, the kind hunters used to track deer, and I tucked them into the knotholes of the trees surrounding the bridge. Then, I went to the local garden center and bought 6 massive, decorative limestone boulders, each weighing about 2 tons, and had them delivered to the very edge of my property line, exactly 22 feet before the bridge began. Monday morning rolled around, and the quote, trap, quote, was set. I wasn't oppos, hiding. I was sitting right there on the bridge in a lawn chair, a thermos of coffee by my side, and my dad's old silver hammer resting in my lap. At 7:15, the first truck appeared, a massive red Mack truck hauling a load of gravel. The driver saw me and laid on the air horn, a sound that usually would have made me jump, but I just took a slow sip of my coffee and waved. He slowed down, confused, as he approached the new limestone pillars I'd placed on either side of the drive. He tried to thread the needle, but he realized the gap was exactly 6 inches narrower than his wheelbase. He hopped out, red-faced and screaming, quote, "Hey, you can't block the road. I got a delivery," quote. I just smiled, the kind of calm, terrifying smile that only comes from knowing you're holding all the aces. Quote. "I'm not blocking the road, sir," quote, I said, pointing to the red stakes I'd driven into the mud, quote. "The public right-of-way ends exactly there at those rocks. Everything between me and you is private soil, and as of 5 minutes ago, you're trespassing on a restricted environmental zone," quote. Before he could respond, a black SUV pulled up behind his truck, and out stepped Arthur, the president of the HOA, a man who wore dry-cleaned khakis to go, quote, hiking, quote, and looked like he'd never had a callus in his life, quote. "Elena, move this junk immediately," quote. He barked, his face turning a shade of purple that matched his silk tie, quote. "We have an emergency injunction being drafted as we speak. You're interfering with a multi-million-dollar contract," quote. Quote. "Funny you should mention contracts, Arthur," quote, I said, standing up and handing him a laminated copy of the 1988 revocation, quote, "because this says you've been sending 10-ton vehicles over a private structure that ISN and oppos. Rated for more than 2, and according to the county assessor I spoke with this morning, you're into oppos, shared access and oppos. Claim is based on a map that has an end oppos. Been legal since the Reagan administration," quote. He looked at the paper, then back at me, his lip curling, quote. "This is a scrap of paper. Elena, we have the best lawyers in the state. We'll bury you in fees before you even get a court date. Now get out of the way before I have this truck push those rocks into the creek," quote. Quote. "You could do that," quote, I said, leaning against the tilted railing of the bridge, quote. "But you might want to check your phone first, because I didn't in oppos. Just called the county. I called the EPA and the Department of Fish and Wildlife," quote. His eyes widened just a fraction, quote. "See, when your trucks cracked the main support beam last Thursday, it started leaking hydraulic fluid and treated with sealant directly into the creek," which, as you know, is a protected spawning ground for the Chinook salmon. I've been recording every single crossing, every spill, and every groan of this bridge on 4 different cameras, and I just sent the live feed to the regional director." End quote. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard. The truck driver, realizing he was now part of a federal environmental investigation, didn't oppose to even wait for Arthur to speak. He just threw his rig into reverse, backed all the way out of my drive, and disappeared. Arthur stood there in the dust, clutching my father's old records, looking at the bridge like it was a ticking time bomb. End quote. "We can fix this," end quote. He stammered, his bravado evaporating like mist. End quote. "We'll pay for the repairs. We'll give you a seat on the board." End quote. End quote. I don't oppose. "Do you want a seat on your board, Arthur?" End quote. I told him, feeling the weight of the last few weeks finally lift. End quote. "I want you to look at these cracks. I want you to see what you did to save 5 minutes of gas. The bridge is closed permanently to everyone but me, and the bill for the restoration, the environmental cleanup, and the private security I'm hiring to keep you off my land, that'll be waiting in your inbox by noon." End quote. The aftermath was a whirlwind. The end quote. Willow Creek end quote. Project ground to a halt for 3 months while they were forced to build a proper access road on their own land, costing them hundreds of thousands in delays. The HOA board was gutted after the news hit the local papers. Turns out I wasn't oppose. The only one they'd been bullying, just the only one with a bridge and a paper trail. Brenda was, end quote, pursuing other opportunities, end quote. And Arthur moved away a year later, unable to handle the dirty looks he got at the grocery store. But the real victory didn't oppose. Happened in a lawyer's office or a courtroom. It happened a few months ago on a quiet Sunday. The community, led by Mrs. Gable and a few of the neighbors who had once whispered behind my back, showed up with hammers, saws, and a mountain of reclaimed oak. They didn't oppose. Do it because they had to. They did it because they realized that when you let a group of people break one person's history, you're just waiting in line for your own to be next. We spent the day rebuilding that bridge, plank by plank, exactly the way my dad would have done it. As the sun went down, casting long, golden shadows across the water, I stood in the middle of the new, reinforced deck. It felt solid. It felt right. I looked down at the base of the main post, where we'd carved a small inscription, "Private property, built by love, defended by truth." I finally felt like I could sit there with my coffee again and not listen for the roar of an engine. I felt like my dad was finally back in his sanctuary. But looking back on it, I sometimes wonder, did I go too far? People say I destroyed the harmony of our neighborhood, that I cost families money and turned a simple construction project into a war zone just for the sake of some old wood and a grudge. Some of my neighbors still won and oppose. Talked to me, claiming I was, end quote, selfish, end quote, for putting my memories above the, end quote, growth, end quote, of the town. So, I'm curious, what would you have done if it were your father's legacy on the line? Is a bridge just a bridge, or is there a point where you have to set a trap and burn the piece to save what's yours? Let me know in the comments if you think I was a hero or just the, end quote, crazy neighbor, end quote, everyone warned you about. And if you've ever had to stand your ground against an HOA that thought they owned the dirt under your feet, I want to hear your story too. Because at the end of the day, we're all just trying to cross over to the other side without losing ourselves in the process.